Well, let's now speak to Fordham, who's the Executive Director of International Drug Policy Consortium. She joins us from London. Thank you for being with us, Anne. So this was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's most controversial campaign promise. Tell us more about how they're going to control and regulate marijuana in Canada, and also who's going to be reaping the benefits, the little producers or big business, in your view?
Thank you for having me. I think that Canada's move is an incredibly positive one. There was a task force last year that took quite a long time to come up with a clear set of recommendations on how Canada should legally regulate cannabis. When the Liberal Party announced this, they said that their plan was to restrict access, to keep it out of the hands of children, and to keep profits out of the hands of criminals. And that's their overarching objective with this policy. I don't think they've clearly defined yet how the policy will look, the specifics, but the recommendations include age restrictions of 18, not selling cannabis in the same places where alcohol is sold,
right,
and sort of ensuring no marketing. In terms of who will benefit, I think that Canada does need to take that question very seriously.
Right.
At IDPC, we don't advocate for a very commercial model and want to ensure that governments restrict commercial interests in an industry like cannabis. And we could look to a country like Uruguay that announced their cannabis regulation policy in 2013. They're about to scale up implementation of that policy this July, and that is a state-regulated cannabis market with absolutely no advertising and limited commercialization.
And, there are more and more countries that are now allowing the legal recreational use of cannabis. Have attitudes towards cannabis use changed around the world? In what regions do you see it has become more acceptable now than it was in the past? And why would you say that is the case?
Well, Canada actually will only be the second country to actually regulate cannabis at the country level, the national level.
Okay.
I think the attitudes towards cannabis have changed over the years. Cannabis is the most widely used drugs internationally. Over 2 million people globally use cannabis. That's about 10 times more than for most other illicit drugs. And I think that governments are increasingly recognizing the failure of law enforcement punitive policies to try to deter people from being involved in the drug market in some way, in particular from consuming drugs and from producing drugs. And I think that recognition is leading for them to look at different approaches and different ways of dealing with the drug market. I think cannabis is a substance where, although it is harmful, perhaps produces lower health harms than some of the other substances, and therefore is a drug where governments are more willing to experiment and perhaps look at a more enlightened and progressive approach. And I think it's great that Canada is doing this with cannabis and looking towards a legally regulated market. Many governments have decriminalized the use of drugs, which is to remove criminal sanctions on the user. But we need to look at the rest of the supply chain and how we manage and control that.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne, for joining us here on the News Grid. Anne Fordham from the International Drug Policy Consortium, live there from London. Thank you for your time.